Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight for the week and the subject of our deep dive are the Inklings. On May 11, 1926, writers J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis met at the Eagle and Child Pub, also known as the Bird and Baby. This meeting led to a regular informal gathering with other literary giants, many of whom taught at Oxford University. The Inklings met to share their work, read each other's drafts, and provide feedback. Notable works produced by these authors included The Chronicles of Narnia by Lewis and The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, both of which featured Christian symbolism and themes. Much of the writing of the Inklings explored themes such as sacrifice, good versus evil, redemption, and divine providence. Uniquely, Lewis credited Tolkien with aiding his conversion from atheism to Christianity in 1931. The group was primarily active in the 1930s and 1940s. Our next historical highlight is Epiphanius of Salamis, who served as bishop in Salamis, Cyprus, during a time of intense doctrinal conflict following the Council of Nicaea. He converted to Christianity after witnessing a monk's act of compassion and later became a disciple of Saint Hilarion. Epiphanius was well known for his miracles, avoidance of indulgence, and commitment to orthodox teachings, and he was chosen as Bishop of Salamis in 367 AD. His works covered early Christian doctrinal disputes and orthodox teachings about the Trinity and salvation. Epiphanius opposed movements such as Arianism and Gnosticism as they challenged core Christian beliefs. His strict stance on orthodoxy sometimes brought him into conflict with other church leaders. Even still, his writings remain a valuable historical source for understanding early church heresies and theological development. He was buried on May 12, 403 AD. Our final historical highlight for the week is Campbell Morgan. As a major figure in 19th century revivalism, Dwight L. Moody's preaching tours in England had a resounding impact, and during his first visit to England, he met a young boy named Campbell Morgan. Morgan would go on to become one of the greatest expository preachers of his time. He began preaching at age 13 and preached regularly throughout England by age 16. Although rejected from formal ministry training early on, he was eventually ordained in the Congregationalist Church and became widely respected for his deep biblical knowledge and preaching ability. Morgan had a close relationship with Moody and the Moody Bible Institute, which he frequented as a guest lecturer. Under his leadership, Westminster Chapel became one of the most influential pulpits in London. His teaching style was centered on a clear, systematic exposition of Scripture that made complex ideas accessible. Morgan died on May 16, 1945. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Michael Ward of Oxford University about the Inklings.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are focused this week of May 11th to talk about actually something that happened on May 11th, 1926. And this was the first meeting, at least we think so, was the first meeting of the Inklings. And we're going to talk about who the Inklings were. There were more than two, Inklings, and who all is involved in that, and primarily to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and to be able to talk about C.S. Lewis is probably our lead conversations on that. And we are very glad to have with us Professor of Theology and Religion at Oxford University, Dr. Michael Ward, who has written extensively on these and has got a good bit of study and time and effort into that is going to share some knowledge with us. So, Dr. Ward, thank you so very much for participating with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nick, for having me. Glad to be with you.
Absolutely. So tell us then, just what the heck is an inkling, and who were they, and how did that kind of get started? And give us a little background on that.
Yeah, well, the Inklings really grew out of the friendship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And as you say, it was in May 1926 that they first met, or at any rate, that we have a recording, a report, an account of that first meeting. It's there in Lewis's diary. He
Mm,
said that at an English faculty meeting, so he and Tolkien both were teaching in the English faculty at Oxford, uh, that he had met a chap called Tolkien, and Lewis described him as a pale, fluent little chap. No harm in him, only needs a smack or so. So that was a rather inauspicious first meeting, and you wouldn't have guessed from that that they would go on to be great friends and
mm,
hugely, hugely, hugely influential on each other.
mm.
And between them, establish or sort of re-establish for the 20th century um, fantasy literature in a Christian register, which would go on to have a global audience,
Mm.
both in book form and in cinematic form. And they would establish the kernel, the core of the group that would grow up around them, which came to be called the Inklings. And they chose the name Inklings partly because it was already the existing name of a group in Oxford, which sort
Wow.
of faded out of existence, and then Lewis and Tolkien sort of took it over. And they like the name because Inklings suggests people with thoughts or notions, but also suggests, rather, amusingly, those who dabble in ink. That was Tolkien's explanation for the name, anyway. And it was really after, so they met in 26, but it wasn't really until 29 that Lewis and Tolkien became really good friends when they
Mm,
started sharing works in progress with each other. And it was soon after that that C.S. Lewis became a Christian. He had been raised a Christian, but had called himself an atheist for about 20 years.
mhm.
And then it was in his early 30s, thanks to the input of Tolkien and another friend called Dyson, that Lewis returned to the practice of the Christian faith. And thereafter, the friendship between the two men really took root and gave rise to not only the Inklings, but to all their works, both fictional and non-fictional, that they wrote thereafter.
How about that? Well, so when they are um, communicating with each other back and forth and talking about their various works and their and where their ink was or their typewriter ribbon or whichever way it may have been, right? That they were. Was it the kind of thing where Lewis says to Tolkien, hey, I really think you ought to make Gandalf look a little bit more like XYZ instead of ABC? I mean, was it that kind of intimacy conversation that they knew what each other was working on, or was it more a general dialogue and a back and forth with obviously some people who were at a much higher intellectual level than I, but they just picked up on ideas from each other about, hey, that you kind of struck me about something you said about
Mm.
that. And I think I'm going to integrate that into character this that I'm working on. That's a loaded big question, I know, but I've,
Yeah, well, it was everything really. I mean, they were very close friends, they were close colleagues. They saw each other several times a week, at least during term time, and
mm,
probably fairly frequently out of term as well, because they were both living in Oxford as well as working in Oxford. Um, and they met um, more socially on usually Tuesday mornings in a pub in Oxford called the Eagle and Child. And that was largely a social meeting where they would just talk college politics and shop and hang out with each other, drink a few glasses before lunchtime. Um, and then more seriously, the sort of writing component of the book, the compositional aspect of the friendship and of the group, more largely happened on Thursday evenings when they would meet
mm,
in C.S. Lewis's college rooms, and that's when they would read aloud the latest chapter of whatever book they were writing. and that would give rise to extempore criticism, comment, back and forth, often very full on. It was not a mutual admiration society. They were not there just to soft soap each other and say, "Oh, how marvelous! You're even more marvelous than I am." No, there was no holds barred. And in fact, Tolkien once said that sometimes if a stranger had come into the meeting, they would have thought that the assembly was of mortal enemies hurling insults at each other. Because they knew and trusted each other so well that they could say anything that came to
Mm.
mind, knowing that the other person would not be offended. One or two members of the group, one in particular, sometimes exceeded the bounds. We might come on
Ah.
to that later. But generally, Lewis and Tolkien, yeah, they were sharing everything, their thoughts, their ideas, their works in progress. And so, I mean, with regard to the Lord of the Rings, especially,
Hmm.
Tolkien said that without Lewis's endless encouragement, he would not have completed it.
Wow.
He says that in a number of places. And given that The Lord of the Rings has gone on to be voted repeatedly as perhaps the greatest work of literature of the 20th century,
Mm.
the fact that Tolkien says it would not exist but for Lewis's input is a major acknowledgement of a debt.
Wow. So these Thursday evenings were more than just the two of them. I mean, there were others that were able to come join back in some of Lewis's rooms for the conversation, and
Yes.
they
Yeah.
kept that separate. You could be in the Tuesday morning social, hey, what's going on with this crazy dean or whatever else you might be talking about, but then Thursday, look, we're getting down to business in here. This is really kind of, or is it more relaxed or maybe not as structured?
Yeah, there was very little structure. Um, the basic distinction between the two meetings, the Tuesday morning and the Thursday evening, was, as I just said, that Tuesday morning was more purely social. Thursday
Hmm.
evening was more deliberately to discuss their works in progress. Um, but there was never any formal agenda, and there was
Mm.
never any formal membership list either. The circle was very various in its constitution. Different friends came sometimes for a period and then stopped coming, or some friends came almost every time, especially
Mm.
C.S. Lewis's brother Warney. He was a very regular attender, but a person who is often listed as one of the major Inklings, Owen Barfield, actually came very little because he lived in London.
Huh.
So he just wasn't around to attend the meetings, even though he was a close friend, especially of Lewis's, and had been, influential on both Lewis and Tolkien through an early book he wrote called Poetic Diction. So it was a very various, sort of informal group. Um, and, they, in a way, they hardly thought of themselves as a significant gathering. I mean, Oxford is full of small groups of friends and colleagues gathering for one purpose or another, for one period or another. And indeed, Lewis and Tolkien were members of other groups. Lewis was part of the Dante Society. Tolkien was part of a group called the Coalbiters, who gathered together to study also old Icelandic literature.
Wow.
Um, so the Inklings, although it's now incredibly famous and incredibly influential, was just one of many groups that they belonged to at the time, and they would probably be very surprised that now in 2026, there are podcasts being devoted to a discussion of this circle.
Literally a century later, right? I mean,
Mm.
because we're right on the 100th anniversary, right, of all of that too. I don't do much math because I'm in the liberal arts, but I think I figured that one out. Okay, at least that's about where we are. So who were some of the other people that we might know their works or as an author or somebody else that would have periodically either been consistently a part of the Inklings or maybe they were just there for a season or a time or something?
Mm. Well, as I just mentioned, Lewis's brother Warren, Warney as he was called, he became something of a writer himself. He published 6 books of French history. Owen Barfield wrote a lot of books of various kinds, but as I say, he hardly ever attended.
Mm.
Even though he's often regarded as one of the key members of the group, he wasn't really. There were some very regular attenders like Robert Havard, who was actually the doctor, the medical doctor that both Lewis and Tolkien went to for their medical needs. But he became a friend, but he wasn't really a writer as such. I mean, he may have published a few small things, but nothing significant.
Okay.
And then for a season, really only during the Second World War, so about 1939 to 1945, a significant member of the group was Charles Williams. And he was, quite well known as a writer, as an editor, as a novelist, as a poet. And he was very close with Lewis. But then he died rather unexpectedly and suddenly in 1945. He was only 58, I think, at the time. He was my age.
Wow.
And so that was the end of his involvement in the group. The group really went on until the late 40s for the Thursday evening meetings, and then they drew to a close. But the Tuesday morning meetings went on for a lot longer. One of the reasons why the Thursday evening meetings came to an end was, as I just indicated a moment ago, there was one member of the group, Hugo Dyson, who really hated The Lord of the Rings.
Really?
He had no patience with The Lord of the Rings. So when Tolkien was there reading aloud the latest chapter of the book, if Dyson was present, he would sort of yawn extravagantly and show how bored he was. And on one occasion, famously or infamously, he's reported to have said, he was reported to have uttered an expletive, and then said, "Oh, not another effing elf." But he had no patience for the elves, for Rivendell and Lothlorien. He just thought it was all nonsense and, fantastic in the worst sense of the word. And because of that, Tolkien wouldn't read in his presence anymore. So if Tolkien had begun reading and then Dyson turned up late, Tolkien would just fold his manuscript and put it away and shut up. And one of the great scholars of the Inklings, Diana Glyer, who's written a great book called The Company They Keep, all about this group, she remarks, I think very perceptively, that it was in large part, or in no small part, because of Dyson, that the group began to fade on the Thursday evenings, because Dyson was sort of attacking the raison d'etre of the group. The whole point of the group was to expose before everybody else the intimate workings of their imagination. And if all you get is scorn and derision in return, well, obviously you're not going to do that so readily. And so Dyson, I don't think he realized necessarily what he was doing, but he was actually undermining the whole group. And so, as I say, the Thursday evening meetings came to an end in the late 1940s.
Well, there's a line between, derision and constructive criticism, right? And so as long as everybody knows, hey, I know kind of where all of my fellow friends here are kind of coming from, if you will, and I know that they are giving me input because they want me to do well, right?
Yeah.
Or they're trying to be helpful, is altogether than being just some naysayer nabob all day long, right? That is just complaining. Who wants to be around that cat? I don't know who. I wouldn't. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Michael Ward by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.